Hey there, it's me, Jack, and in today's episode, I'm going to be talking about caching. Caching is a fundamental concept when you are building out a web application that you need to perform well for the second and so on request. The core concept behind caching is that once you perform an expensive operation, that the subsequent request should be cached or held in a local, more efficient spot that you can look up by key typically. So normally you might have something like, let's pretend you're returning users, and let's also, for the sake of argument, pretend that you are pulling in a handful of associated tables for that user. Perhaps it's their addresses they've been to, maybe even some uh, contacts that they know. Maybe there's some special folder structure that you need to have, tags, comments, whatever it is, and that happens to be an expensive set of database operations to perform. So let's say when you first log in that user, that is the time that your database will perform that lookup. And then on subsequent pages, as you navigate around, maybe you'll also need to be doing that same request over and over again. And the concept behind caching is that you save a representation of that object in some form of cache. Now, you might use something like Redis, which is a dictionary service, the remote dictionary service. Um, right there, you might use memcached. You might even store a representation flattened down in a database if you wanted, or you may throw it into memory in the actual application server. So if you're using PHP, you might use APCU, which is like the alternative PHP cache for userland code objects and whatnot. So you have opcache there for your actual code, but then you might want a place to store actual objects. And in that case, you can actually store complete objects in APC, for example, and then the subsequent time when you call the lookup there, depending on how you write that, you might call like APC fetch, check to see if it exists to begin with, and then anytime you go to save and update, you will need to manage updating that cache. There's a couple of trade-offs that are important to note. One, you need to make a decision if you have multiple web servers for capacity reasons, whether or not you want to centralize the cache, or if you are okay with the cache being separate on each server. If it's something that updates very rarely and you're okay with some drift in there, then perhaps bringing it as local and having repeated ones is acceptable. Other times it makes more sense to have a shared cache or a shared like Memcache or Redis server that all of your web servers would talk to and then be able to leverage that. That way, if server A were to update the resource, it's updated, and then now if the next request happens to land on server B from the load balancer, it too can make a remote call out to your shared cache and be able to fetch that information, and it reduces some synchronization problems or having a record in your cache that's now no longer consistent with the rest. Alternatively, you can implement strategies with clearing caches on those systems if you need your cache local, or you can even create a mechanism where the cache is basically subscribed to and you'll propagate out the caches across your systems. That can work okay as well, but now you're really talking trade-offs in terms of performance versus complexity there. So you might get some incremental performance, but you've just ballooned out the complexity in your code and therefore potentially increased bugs and errors. There's lots of different caching libraries out there. Everything, and it's also implemented at many layers in an application. Sometimes you want to do it at like just a whole path level, just cache an entire page. That can be very efficient for a read-heavy type of application. Alternatively, you may implement caching at a object level. So just in going off our original example of caching a user request from the database, anywhere you have that expensive operation. And sometimes you might put that at a method level. So maybe you're fetching a collection of objects in your method. You can throw that in there. If you're in the Java ecosystem and using Spring Framework, there is a caching annotation that you can leverage as well. That works out amazingly well. And of course, the same can be applied in the JavaScript equivalents or TypeScript-based applications where you're running like a Node.js server. They also have concepts of caching. So that's a really important area if you're encountering some performance problems with your application. one of the first things to look at after you've already tried to optimize your queries as much as you can is go, can we cache this? And if so, think through the possible situations where things can go sideways with caching. So some of those we talked about were being able to make sure that when you write it, is it a write-through cache where that information is written in two places at once, like the main database and then your cache, and then it's centralized and everything's updated? Or are you needing to propagate out your cache? Are you okay with having one read for each web server? If you have 30 web servers or 50 web servers, are you okay with that request happening 30 or 50 times, or do you need it to happen once? These are all considerations you need to think about when you are building a caching layer in there. One final consideration that's important is depending on how you have built your system, if let's say you have a cache and it is written in a LRU type of way, a least recently used eviction, meaning that the information that's least recently used will be evicted out if you need to store another object in there, means that those objects may get deleted out in there as well. So memory management and cache is important, sizing is important, and then the final consideration to make is sometimes you want to pre-warm a cache, and that's to avoid the stampede effect. And that stampede effect is when you have all of your web servers are concurrently, say, requesting that same object, slamming your database, all for that same piece of information. So a strategy to help mitigate that is to pre-warm a cache, like in a cron job, or something along those lines, a scheduled action, or even if you know that the next request is going to be like a get on that resource and you've got the save operation there, you might want to just stuff priming that cache in a save operation if you have something heavy in there that just based on the behavior of your application, that's how it's going to be used. I hope you find this interesting. This is just one of many topics that I'll be addressing when it comes to DevOps and just programming. This will just be a brief chat on like what do you want to learn. So if you've got something that you're interested in learning more, or you want just to hear some perspective on what it is at a 10,000 foot view, go ahead and put that comment below. I will check out the comments and I'll be producing more videos. Looking forward to hearing more from you. Thanks so much.